Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending upon where you find yourself in the world today. We are glad you've joined us for our very first Church Goes Global conversation. My name is Andrew Gale.
And I am not Andrew Gale, even though it says so on my camera, but my name is Nate Tapman, and we are so thankful that you have joined us today. And before we get into today's topic, we wanted just to take a few minutes just to kind of share what this is all about. We're calling this webinar The Church Goes Global. And so, Andrew, what is it? What is it about? Why are we here? Who is this for?
Yeah, so this idea for this webinar series was kind of born out of the Global Strategy Missions Leaders Roundtable, which is a group of missions leaders from around our movement that get together a few times a year to just dialogue about missions-related issues. And through that, we talked about having an opportunity to kind of grow in education and learning around missions-related topics. And so the Church Goes Global is a webinar series that looks at current cross-cultural issues through the lens of the local North American church engagement. So we invite guest speakers to share from their experience, from their expertise, connecting back to how the local church can be on mission in the world. So we hope that through these Church Goes Global webinars, we have an opportunity to kind of wrestle with some tough questions of how to connect and engage with global work in a way that's healthy, as well as being a catalyst for engagement in your local church. So we really want to help churches think about how to engage on a global scale. And it's hosted by Global Strategy, which is just a great benefit as well.
Yeah, and I'm really excited about this. I'm excited with one, to be able to highlight and celebrate some of the guests that we're going to be having on here, including our guest for today, Greg Wiens. Just to kind of share with you a little bit, we are obviously doing this on a Zoom format, a Zoom platform, and this is being recorded. So if you can't make it live every time that we do this, every 6 weeks or so, we are recording these and we will publish them out on various platforms, whether social media, websites, emails, that sort of thing. Again, wanting to put this information into your laps and trying to make this helpful for the local church, for the missions pastor, for the missions committee, for the pastor who oversees missions amongst all the other ministries and things like that they're trying to oversee. So we're excited about this, and we're thankful for the technology like Zoom to be able to do this.
Yeah, and so we have a great lineup of speakers. We've kind of broken this up into 2 semesters. So we'll do kind of 4 6 weeks. Every 6 weeks we'll have a webinar. We'll do 4 this semester and 4 in the fall semester. We're really excited. We're bringing on incredible guests from around the world to discuss, we think, really important topics. So our next speaker, our next webinar will be on March 6th at 2 p.m. Eastern time, just like this one is. We're gonna have the guest, her name is Esther Jadhav. She will be discussing cultural competency and theology. And Esther is a PhD student at Asbury Theological Seminary and studying cultural competency. So she's going to talk about the intersection. Today we're talking about EQ, emotional intelligence. She's going to talk about CQ, cultural competency and cultural intelligence, and how that connects to theology and the work that we're doing.
Yeah, then on April 17th, we're going to be joined by Samir Salibi. Samir is a church planter in Paris. He was born in Lebanon. He and his family moved to Paris, and he has been living there, I believe, for about 20 years at least. And he has planted a church that directly works with the refugees coming from North Africa and the Middle East. And so we're excited to have him on here and talk about how he is reaching out to the global refugees and just talking to refugees and talking about the global refugee issues and various forms of that topic.
And then our final guest for this semester is going to be Gina Thomas. She works at the Chalmers Center, which you may not have heard of the Chalmers Center, but you've probably heard of some of the books they put out. The Chalmers Center, 2 of the leaders there are Brian Ficker and Stephen Corbett, who wrote When Helping Hurts. So Gina works with them. Her history is that she was a missionary in Mexico doing international development work. She ran a coffee shop that proceeds went from there to support a local school. So she's going to talk about kind of healthy international development and how we do that from a local church perspective. So we're really excited about all of these webinars. And again, the focus of each one is going to be tied back into the local church. So we hope that there's something that you as a local church leader, can glean from this. One addition, for our next webinar, I'm going to go ahead and put the registration link in the chat. So anytime during this conversation, if you get bored with what Greg's saying, you can just hop on there and register for the next event. So I'm sure you won't, but it'll be there for the entire time so that you can use it.
Yeah, we also just want to do a quick introduction too of ourselves. Again, many of you know who we are, but in case you don't, my name again is Nate Tapman. I am the Mission Advancement Pastor at County Line Church in Northeast Indiana. I've been on staff here at County Line just a little over 11 years, going on 12 years this summer. I oversee missions and multiplication. Been married to Stacy for over 20 years. We have 5 kids. Our oldest is getting married this year. Kid number 3 is graduating from high school this year. And then we also have our youngest 2 who were born in Costa Rica. We adopted them about 3 years ago. And we have a lot of fun with our very ethnically diverse family. We speak a lot of Spanglish in our house, and we have a lot of fun. I'm passionate about the local church. I love the local church. Have given most of my adult life to the local church in various forms, and so I'm just excited to be a part of this and to work through some of these issues and topics that at times can seem, kind of daunting, and as they're big global issues, but I don't think that should allow us or keep us from wrestling with them at the local church level. And so I love the local church. I love helping the local church to become healthy, become makers of disciples, and to multiply. And so that you'll see that and hear that coming out of me, hopefully, as we go through these webinars.
And then I'm Andrew Gale. I'm the Executive Director at Global Strategy, which is the international arm for Church of God Ministries here in Anderson, Indiana. I was a missions pastor for 5 years at Church of the Crossing, so ordained minister in the Church of God, and have an incredible passion for the local church as well. After being at Church of the Crossing, I left there to pursue more education and intercultural studies at Asbury Theological Seminary. Before then coming and taking on this role. So I've been married for almost 10 years in April to autumn. We have 2 great kids. Eleanor is 6 years old, Eli is 2. And, I, for a long time, have just been really interested and fascinated by different cultures, diversity of cultures globally. And so I'm passionate about helping the church discover ways that they can engage in a world in culturally appropriate ways, in a world that is similar and yet also very different than they are. And that's so much of what we do. I worked at a local church and now I work here at our national offices, but so much of what we do here at Global Strategy is walking alongside the local church globally. But we also have an opportunity to walk alongside the North American church and helping them connect in healthy and culturally appropriate ways around the world. And I love getting to be a part of those conversations and helping to see that happen.
Yeah, now we got all the formalities out of the way. I want to bring in Greg to the conversation. Greg Wiens, many of you, again, know his name, may or may not have recognized him or have met him. But I've known Greg, it seems like a long time, but it may have, maybe 4 or 5 years. I don't know. I haven't done the math. But ironically enough, Greg and I first met not in the U.S., but I believe it was in Italy during a roundtable with the Three Worlds team.
I think it was, yeah.
So I think that's the first time we met. So we met in a cross-cultural context. And, I'm not going to steal a lot of Greg's thunder here, but Greg has been not just a great colleague, but a great friend and also a mentor to me. And I know to many of you on this webinar as well. So Greg, maybe just give us an introduction of who you are, some of your experiences, your past, and what has led you to here today.
Yeah, and then we're going to get into the webinar, right? Because I'll have if I do too much of that, we won't take too much time with that. But anyway, I do want to say that I don't think, Nate, that your passion was the church. I thought your passion was coffee. I mean, I've traveled the world, and that's all you talk about is coffee. Anyway.
That's all you ask about me is coffee.
Oh, okay. All right. Yeah, I've been married probably longer than at least you two guys have been alive. I've been married 42 years. And have 3 kids, 7 grandkids. Mary and I are at a wonderful stage of life. Ironically, I've had 6 different careers. I don't mean jobs. I mean literally careers. And it's, I guess you could define them a little bit like a serial entrepreneur, but I'm also kind of like ADD. So, I don't know. The fun thing is, God has used me in the same way in every different career, but it's just different people have written the paycheck. I was an engineer. I have an engineering degree, MBA, so I became an engineer for General Motors, engineering manager kind of stuff, and then left General Motors, went to seminary, went to Anderson, got an MDiv in seminary, went on staff at Salem Church in Dayton, Ohio. Was part of there, and the church went through some pretty tough times and went from about 2,000 to 600, and it was pretty tough riding that down. I went out to Wichita, Kansas, took a church, Pawnee Avenue, and that's where I actually met Andrew, and his mom was on my staff. It was a great church. Church kind of grew pretty significantly, and we were able to plant a church, daughter a church, and the daughter exploded. And I really felt like I was God's gift to planting and the ministry. So I came to Orlando. I mean, if you're going to plant, why not come to Orlando? So, and this was before planting was cool, and it was like 32 years ago. So we came to Orlando to plant, and God proceeded to pretty much break me in that process. He took me apart limb from limb and showed me that he didn't need me for the kingdom. And it was a very, very tough time. And I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy, but on the other hand, I kind of like the process that I guess the product where we ended up. And in that process, I went back and got my doctorate in psychometrics, basically went on staff at the University of Central Florida, taught for 5 years full-time in their College of Education, taught statistics, psychometrics, testing and measurement, and was also working with the Church of God voluntarily at that time in the state of Florida, overseeing church planting. And then I became the regional pastor, the state pastor from Florida for about 13, 14 years. And we're pretty invasive at trying to help churches toward mission, both locally and globally. We actually spent over $1 million in India through Florida and some other places. And it was really cool. And in the process, I began getting requests to kind of help other people do what we were doing in Florida. So we created a couple organizations, one called Healthy Growing Churches, another one called Healthy Growing Leaders. And eventually there wasn't enough time for Greg to go around with all those different organizations. So I left Florida Church of God Ministries about 6 years ago to do full-time HGC, Healthy Growing Churches, which focuses on really helping churches turn toward mission, and then Healthy Growing Leaders, which is helping leaders, understand what it means to be healthy and make significant impact to their lives. And so within the last year, I've kind of made that transition from HGC more to focusing on HGL. So I'm doing just a lot of assessment stuff right now, doing some writing. I've written 4 books the last 2 years, have a couple more projects that are going right now. And it's kind of fun to be my age and starting to write, because I feel like I have something to write about. So anyways.
That's awesome. That's awesome. And, kind of going down this road of assessments, obviously one of the big tools that you use is assessing potential leaders on their emotional intelligence or EQ. And so we wanted to bring Greg in and just talk more about EQ. I think it's something that as I have gotten to know Greg, and as I've gotten to, I've been assessed in quite a few times, and have been used as a guinea pig as Greg works on his assessments and tools and that sort of thing. But it has the knowledge and information of EQ, knowing where I've been assessed, knowing my scores, knowing how it affects me as a leader, but also as a husband and as a father. It's opened up my eyes to see in areas of growth in my own personal life, as well as in my ministry and leadership. And EQ doesn't just fit in a ministry context, but it goes across the board. And so we wanted to bring Greg in and just talk about kind of EQ in and of itself, and then have some follow-up questions in terms of how does EQ play a role in missions, and coming back then to the local church as well. So Greg, if you want to go ahead, I'll just kind of hand it over to you and
I'll do that. And so what time we want to have questions? 245, what, somewhere around there, or what?
Yeah, 245, 250, I think would be good.
All right.
Somewhere 245-ish.
All right. Yeah, I want to talk about emotional intelligence. You guys should see, can you all see my screen now?
Yes.
And I mean that when I say it's an emotional intelligence, I want to talk about that, but for the most missional pastors I know. A little pun on, play on words, but the reality is, I believe that. In fact, I have to tell you that I get along with most missions pastors better than anyone else. And maybe because I've had to travel the world with them and I trust them and they protect me. But anyway, whatever it is, but I mean that. And so I want to talk about emotional intelligence. And the reality is, the first thing I want to point out about EQ is that, most of emotional intelligence lies way below the waterline. And like this picture, this is a picture of an iceberg, and it's an actual depiction of what the percentages are. And that's pretty much what EQ is. You can see certain things of EQ from the outside, but most of EQ is what happens below the waterline. And so that's why I want to talk a little bit about that. And I'll probably say some things that you may disagree with. That's okay. Because in fact, I'm going to probably use you, Andrew, and you, Nate, as a couple examples, and we'll have you guys talk about it in the middle of this because you both have worked on your EQ well. But as you can see there, I mean, one of the interesting things is, emotional intelligence is the balance between the rational brain and the emotional brain. And see, we often think that EQ is the emotional brain. It's not the emotional brain. And it's not the cognitive, the rational brain. It's actually the arrow there. It's the balance of what brings those two together. And so as I talk about EQ, I want you to realize it's not just talking about your emotions, but it's talking about how do you bring EQ, emotional intelligence, is bringing a balance between both of those perspectives or side to your brain. So what, if that's true, what EQ is not, it's not about being emotional. I mean, some people think they don't have good EQ because they don't cry all the time. They don't, that EQ is not being emotional. So don't think as you work on your EQ that it means you're going to become a babbling idiot or whatever. I don't know, but you don't become emotional all the time if you raise your IQ, or EQ. It is not sharing every emotion that you experience. It's not just like, blurting when you feel stuff. It's not demonstrating when you're sad, being, just really sad or down or moody, so it's not just verbalizing or sharing every emotion that you experience. And lastly, it's not impulsiveness. Because as I said a moment ago, it's that balance that you see there. So it's none of these three. So what is it? Well, let's talk about it. It's really, the cool thing about EQ is that there's simply emotional, hear me say emotional intelligence and EQ. EQ is a shortened phrase for emotional quotient, if you will, from like IQ. And the interesting thing about, we'll get to that in a moment. But I think the interesting thing about emotional intelligence, EQ, is that these are skill sets that you can learn. They're just skill sets. Now, for some of you, you may have been taught those as you were very young, but we'll get to that in a moment. The first skill set, the first set of skills, and by the way, you can take an instrument. There's a whole bunch of instruments out there. I'm writing one right now, which will be done in about 30 days. It'll be up there. It'll be free on the internet. But the reality is, there's a whole bunch of EQ instruments out there. And you can, and they all have a bunch of different scales, but they all will have at least these 4 scales embedded somewhere in there, okay, somewhere in their scales. And the first one is, how well do you identify your own emotions? Now, it doesn't mean just you're angry, but it also means when you're angry and why you are angry. So it's identifying and understanding both. So it's being able to identify what you're feeling in the moment, in real time, while at the same time knowing why you are experiencing. And that is, believe it or not, just a skill set you can learn. I grew up in a German home, and emotions were one of those things we didn't order. So, it didn't come in our car. So I wasn't taught emotions. And my, in fact, if I was having a tough day, my dad would just tell me to go out and run a lap. You'll feel better after you run a lap, or whatever it is, And so I had to learn EQ. I didn't have the privilege of starting out in a home that really valued that nurturing kind of getting in touch with my own feelings, what I was experiencing. But you can learn it. Second set of skills is that it is not only identifying what you're experiencing and why, but also identifying what others are experiencing and why. So as we talk about high EQ, I mean it to encompass all four of these skill sets. The second one is, do you know when you're talking with someone what they're experiencing, and are you able to identify why they are experiencing it? Again, you may think that's kind of odd, but that you can learn that. That is a skill set. We'll talk at the end here about how do you develop some of these skills. But that's a skill set. You learn to read their emotions, and then you learn to understand why they are experiencing it. It's kind of, Heifetz in his book, Leadership on the Line, talks about every leader in every conversation should go to the balcony of the conversation and should look down and see themselves, and they should see the other person. And as they look at themselves and the other person, they should say, what am I experiencing, or what am I feeling at this moment? What are they feeling at this moment? And that's the beginning of EQ. The third skill set is to, once you understand and why you're experiencing it, it's to be able to manage them. Now, by managing emotions, it doesn't mean suppressing them. It doesn't mean keeping them down. What it does mean is, as you've processed cognitively, remember, it's the balance of the emotional and the cognitive brain. So you process, you become aware of what you're experiencing, you understand why you're experiencing, then you cognitively say, how do I use that at this moment in the conversation? So it's a balance of understanding that. So managing your emotions means sometimes you appropriately express your emotions in one way. It may mean other times you don't express them, because to be appropriate means you don't express them. So you have, again, there's a balance that occurs, but it does say that God has given us emotions. I really believe that, to be used in our personal lives, in our relationships, and as importantly, in our leadership. The fourth skill set is to manage other people's emotions. Once you're able to identify what other people are experiencing, then how good are you at helping them express their emotions in the context of your relationship? How good are you at bringing them out, so to speak, with bringing their emotions out in the context of your relationship? Now, there's a couple things we know about emotions, or EQ. The first is that EQ originates in our culture of origin. Part of that is your family of origin. Part of that's where you grew up, the culture, and all those kinds of things that's involved in that, because we know culture plays a great deal of influence on EQ. But if you were brought up in a culture, a family that said, you don't yell at your sister, can't you see this has not been a good day? Can't you understand? You begin to develop those skills early in life. As I shared a moment ago, that was not my privilege. I grew up in a home that we didn't develop good EQ. So for me, it was one that it was skills that I had to learn. And actually, I had a coach my first coach was my wife's pastor. He was an engineer and then became a pastor, and I was still an engineer at the time. And he saw this in me. I mean, he didn't say you lack EQ, Greg, but because they didn't coin the term yet. But he knew that I was a little out of touch with my emotions, and so he suggested I began to emotionally journal. And we'll get to this as we get to one of the example, or one of the exercises. But you can see it here. All these books right over here, those are my life's journals. Now, they'll be burnt when I die because they have a lot of stuff in there I wouldn't want to read. Anyone to read, because they're my emotions. Okay, they're raw. But I would journal at the end of the day or the beginning of the next day what I was feeling and what I sensed other people were feeling. Not whether it was right or wrong. I just began to get it out. And as I began to get it out, I began to develop it. And that's the last statement here, is that EQ is dynamic, that you can develop your EQ. You can develop any one of these four skill sets and increase your EQ. Now, it from my perspective, most often happens with coaching. The emotional journaling I just talked about is probably the best exercise I've ever seen in allowing people to increase. But you truly can see it happen. Nate, you've seen that, haven't you? I mean, because we've talked about this with you, Nate, and you've worked on it, and you've developed these four skill sets, right?
Yeah. I would say, especially the first two, I've always kind of had a good grasp on being able to identify emotions. It's been the last two where I've had to grow more in those, and how do you manage your own emotions when you allow the emotional aspect to kind of get in the way, and then also how do you manage others' emotions? Again, those have been more of a stretch for me, but yeah, I've been able to grow and develop all four of those areas.
Yeah, as we've gone through assessments, I've seen you develop that over the years. And Andrew, I would suggest you were one that probably grew up in a pretty nurturing home And so, Andrew, you probably had a head start over a lot of people in this area. Is that not true?
Yeah, I mean, I think that certainly we in my family talked about emotions more than I think other families. I just assumed that was normal. I don't think I realized that was something that was maybe abnormal, but until we started processing EQ stuff. And again, because you know my family a little bit, we're able to actually speak some of that in that I don't know that I would have even picked up on. So yeah, absolutely. I think that family of origin, you talk about that, I think is really huge. And it's something that even with my family, I have to process, like how we do that well in our family of origin. So my kids grow up with the ability to understand, identify their emotions and others, and then find ways to manage those.
Yeah, it is interesting. When we talk about the sins of the father are sometimes carried over to the sons and the daughters. This is one of those areas where if you don't have an EQ, you can't give it to your kids, to be very candid with you. And so it is a generational thing. It's not hereditary in any way, shape, or form, but it's the nature and nurture kind of thing. We've created a nurturing environment that either inhibits or encourages EQ. It's kind of interesting. So, what is so important about EQ? I like, that's what EQ is. Let's talk about what is so important. And I'm going to speed through some of this because I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I just want to, because you're probably convinced that it's pretty important. But let me just share a little of the research. I mean, it's really interesting that more people will follow you for your EQ than your IQ. And I'll get into some statistics here in a moment. But that's beyond an average IQ, which is about 100. And by the way, IQ we know is as dynamic as EQ. You can increase your IQ, so I got a story where I was in 8th grade diagnosed with an IQ somewhere below 85, so I just will tell you that. My parents didn't tell me that until after I graduated with my doctorate in statistics, but the reality is, IQ is very fluid too. They used to think it was static, it's not. But what we do know is that IQ beyond of 100, it isn't actually, it's not correlated with much except weight. People tend to be way more that have higher IQ. It doesn't mean you go out and, feast on something, you're going to get smarter. No, actually, but it just means that IQ is not related to much, but EQ is really related to it's people find they have much more higher fulfillment in their relationships with higher EQ. They see better team performance. I'll give you that, some statistics on that in a moment. They're happier. There's been research and tests done to show all this stuff. They tend to be more resilient, higher EQ. Now and if you want any of the research backing this up, I can give you papers on all this and some of the research, but this is very important as we talk about cross-cultural ministry, because we do know that resilience, keeps people hanging in there. Duckworth calls it grit. You can call Angela Duckworth calls it grit, but it's basically a lot of research has been done on resilience, and especially cross-culturally with missionaries, resilience is very important. And in fact, people who go on cross-cultural kind of experiences, resilience is very important. And EQ is highly correlated with resilience, which is interesting. In fact, this I wanted to read this. This is from a report that came out just July this last year. And it says, research points to emotional intelligence as a critical factor that sets star performers apart from the rest of the pack. The connection is so strong that 90% of top performers, as measured through some very quantitative measures, have high emotional intelligence. On the flip side, just 20% of the bottom performers have high emotional intelligence. So you can be at the top. You can be a top performer without EQ. You really can, but the chances of that are very slim. And I know I've talked to a bunch of people who say, well, I can really perform really well and be without developing your EQ. Well, the chances are you're probably not going to do it. 90% at the top have high EQ. So, we look at that, and as far as it's very important that you develop EQ. A recent Gallup survey on the top 5 managerial failures are like this: poor interpersonal communication skills, EQ. Ineffective team leaders, EQ. Resistance to change, EQ. Disappointing results, no, it's not really EQ. But inability to see beyond their functional silos, EQ. 4 of the 5 failures in management are directly related to EQ, which is really interesting. So continuing to talk about what's so important about EQ, I think it's important to look at some biblical examples. King Saul, the Old Testament, this is interesting. And obviously we're eisegeting somewhere here. We're reading into the Old Testament, but there's King Saul. And if you remember from 1 Samuel chapter 15 and so forth, it's where God's getting really frustrated with Saul. And why he gets frustrated is because Samuel was supposed to come and make some sacrifices in this battle, and Saul was supposed to obey him. And if you read the story, it's really frustrating because it appears that Saul directly disobeys what God wants him to do. And it's really interesting because Samuel comes, he gets there late, and Samuel confronts him in that passage. And the interesting thing for me about that is that I don't really think, if you read Saul's response, I don't think he was lying. I think he was just clueless. He had no clue what was going on emotionally in his own life. And so he just reacted impulsively. He just reacted according to his emotions. He had no EQ. Now, and because in fact, if you look, when Samuel confronts him, the first thing he does is repent. I mean, it's like, oh man, did I blow it? So I don't think it was a intentional. I mean, you may read it that way, but from reading his repentance, it doesn't look like he was really out to disobey God. I don't think that was it, because you don't get any indication of that before this event. I think he was just clueless. And then you look at another person who followed him, King David. David has significant EQ. It's really cool to watch how David is able to navigate and work with leaders of leaders. Why is he such a great leader of leaders? It's because he really understood. Read David's whole life. He knew how to lead leaders. Now, I do want to point out that David had a major event in his life called Bathsheba, the moral failure. And one of the things you need to understand about EQ is it's not like once you got it, you always got it. Because if you read David's life, after the moral failure of Bathsheba, it seems, if you continue reading chronologically in his life, from that point forward, he begins to lose his EQ. He does all kinds of stupid things. He doesn't confront his kids. But it seems to have upset his equilibrium so much between remember the cognitive brain and the emotional brain. It upset that equilibrium so much that after that point, he's not able to lead leaders. His EQ tanks after that point, which is really kind of a sad thing, but that's a topic for a whole nother discussion. But so you hear me say that once you have EQ doesn't mean you're always going to keep it. It's a dynamic, or it's fluid. If you look at the apostles, John appears to possess a higher EQ. And I use John as an example because John's not the real verbal one of the apostles, but yet it appears if you just study John's life, he was always in touch. And even read his gospel, when you read the insights that he brings into the other apostles' lives, it appears that John really had tremendous insight emotionally into where other people were. Now, I also find that interesting that when Jesus is hanging on the cross, who does he give his mother to? John. Because John really appears to have good EQ and would know how to care for her. On the other hand, it wasn't Peter. I love Peter. I mean, I share a lot of attributes with Peter, but, he's loud and he jumps to conclusions. He's the first guy on, he's a little ADD, all those things. But the reality is he's clueless half the time on the emotional stuff. He is just clueless. He's impulsive. He's out of control. He doesn't have a clue of what's going on inside of him or others. I mean, they come to arrest Jesus. What does he do? He grabs the sword and he cuts off Malchus's ear. I mean, he has no clue that that's not part of the agenda at this point, Pete. So, it is interesting. And I say that because sometimes people think, well, just because someone's a high I or they're really boisterous or they really express it may mean they have high EQ. That's not necessarily the case. I want to share a personal story here. And this dates back a couple of decades, at least over a decade. And it predates Andrew's tenure, and it predates his predecessor's tenure. It goes way back. And I was asked to come to a mission field, and I'm going to keep this as vague as I can, to kind of help them understand what was happening with some of the missionaries. And as I went to that mission field somewhere in the nation or somewhere in the world, I looked at all the on-site missionaries. And again, this was decades ago, so you don't try to figure out who this is and where it was. But the reality was, most of those missionaries who were from the States, who had gone to these countries, a variety of countries in this region, were clueless. They couldn't have survived in an Anglo culture. They had no EQ, and they were clueless on how to work with me as an American coming from their home culture. as well as it translated directly into their inability to integrate with the indigenous leaders of those cultures. And it was really interesting that we often, and as I challenged the leaders at that point who were overseeing those missionaries, I said, these people, they're kind of asocial. They lack basic social skills. Why would you think they could do well in the mission field? They said, well, they had a call, and without, just because they didn't fit well in our home culture didn't mean they wouldn't fit well in that culture. But what I want to point out is that if you're not able, I'm qualifying this. I have no research to point this out, but I will say that if you're not able to develop EQ in your home culture, it is going to be a lid when you go to a foreign culture. I really believe that EQ is a major lid to cross-cultural effectiveness. And this is where CQ, cultural quotient, and EQ overlap. Because my observation is people who develop good EQ have the capacity to develop good CQ, and vice versa. Because it's some of the same skill sets, simply applied in a different domain. Same kind of skill sets, understanding what's going on in your life, understanding what's going on in other people's lives. It's just EQ is dealing with emotionally, CQ is dealing with it culturally. But it's the same skill sets. So I say that, and that's why I think it's really, really important. Forget all the management stuff and leadership stuff and the failures of leadership without EQ. I really believe it's a significant limiting factor in cross-cultural effectiveness. So let me just go through this in 5 minutes. Or how do you develop EQ? Well, it's not easy. I'm going to recommend some books. And by the way, Andrew and Nate have copies of this, so they can send you these books. Don't worry about copying them down. But this one is called Coaching for Emotional Intelligence by Wall. It's just a short little book, and I think he probably gives the best overall perspective and background and view of EQ in a very short treatment. Another one's called Leadership and Self-Deception. It's a great little story. It's never mentions EQ, but it's all about EQ. It's, as a leader, how do we deceive ourselves by not understanding the emotional climate of the room or the people we're dealing with. Great book. It's a million bookseller in the business world. It's just Leadership and Self-Deception. Another one is A Failure of Nerve by Friedman. This is a little longer, a little harder. Friedman died writing the book. I mean, it wasn't that hard on him, but anyways, he died writing the book, and his wife finished it some, but I mean, it's really, he counseled, by the way, 6 presidents. This guy was a therapist. Wrote a book just for pastors called Generations to Generations. Was Jewish, I might add. But in there he says so often, if you don't, he doesn't address, again, EQ. He doesn't talk about EQ, but he basically says, if you don't understand the emotional climate of what's happening in the organization which you're trying to lead, you will eventually experience a failure of nerve in your leadership because you've not appropriately understood what was going on below the surface. Remember the iceberg, what's going on underneath the water. Great book. Culture maps, which you're going to deal all with that. I mean, Aaron Myers, you're going to deal with that, in next week, or was it next month, or is it a couple from now?
Yeah, the next webinar is 6 weeks from now. Yep.
Yeah, you can deal with that. Again, Aaron Myers, she's great, and I know you hear more about that. But again, why I mention culture maps in the context of this talk is because to me it's a similar skill set. She gives, by the way, 8 different ways of looking at culture. And what I love about it, it's not that you can translate those 8 ways into EQ so much as she gives 8 ways. And if you really try to learn those 8 ways, you have to learn to study people, and you have to learn to study yourself. And it's that's the skill set of studying other people, studying yourself, that if you learn that skill set, you can then use it in your emotions. So that's why I pointed that out. And then the last thing I point out is emotional journaling. I mentioned that a moment ago. For me personally, it's been over 37, 38 years I've been emotionally journaling. And by emotionally journaling, I don't write down, well, this is what I did yesterday. I write down, this is what I felt. This is what I thought. This is how my thoughts and feelings intersected. This is what I perceived other people felt, and this is what I perceived other people were thinking. And as I did that initially, then the day after or the night of, I found that, as I did that long enough, all of a sudden I began to develop the skills, and this is years worth, by the way, I'm condensing it, but over years I began to develop the skills where I could do that in real time, like Heifetz talks about, and go to the balcony. And so that for me, that was probably the best exercise of developing it. The last thing is, I truly believe, just as I had a coach who had me start journaling and then coached me through and walked me through some of that stuff, I believe that the best way to develop EQ is being coached by someone who does have high EQ. It's kind of like riding a bike. Yeah, you can learn to ride a bike with no one helping you, but it's sure a whole lot better with someone helping you, holding the bike, putting training wheels on and everything else. And so EQ, if in fact EQ is related to what you're experiencing and how you're expressing what you're experiencing, and then reading other people and what they're experiencing and helping them express that in your relationship, well, then a coach can give you an outside perspective that you cannot see. They'll see you do things, they'll hear you do things. And so coaching just expedites the process so much more. So with that, that's my contact information, and I open it up for questions, I guess.
That's great. Thank you so much, Greg. I really appreciate walking through that with us. And just so people know, there is a question and answer section on the Zoom that you can write a question, and there's ways that you can do it both anonymously and with your name. Either way is fine. And just so you know, when you write a question, it doesn't automatically pop up on everybody's screen. It'll come to one of us as hosts. And then, so you don't have to be worried, like, I don't know if this is a good question or whatever, because not everyone's going to see it until we go through it. So just to give you some freedom there as you think about questions related to EQ that you may want to ask Greg. And we use Greg often, just so you know, for our assessments for our missionaries. So as we kind of work through putting people on the field, placement, making sure there's fit in with our organization and with the work that we're calling them to cross-culturally, Greg is a major tool in helping us kind of think through those assessments, going through EQ and DISC and a number of other assessments that help us kind of, I would describe it as seeing what the problems could be in the future before they happen. So it's not that we're trying to solve problems or change people, but to say, hey, here's some of the tendencies, here's some of the personality traits or core that may come back in the missions community right now and developing, they can.
Well, it's interesting for me, there's a major difference between issues to be managed and problems to be solved. And what I mean by that is issues to be managed. We've all got personalities. I'm a DI in the DISC, and there are times I need to shut my D down or shut my I down and not say anything, just shut up. That's a condition to be managed, but I'm always going to be a DI. So that's an issue to be managed. A problem to be solved is EQ. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's something that I can solve. I can work on that, and I can solve that issue. And so I think that's important to realize. Sometimes I find people trying to solve their issues that are just to be managed. You're never going to be a different person, but you can, and sometimes they're trying to manage problems that could be solved. Yeah. So I think it's important to remember there are issues to be managed and problems to be solved, and EQ is a problem to be resolved. So.
Great. I have a question just to kind of start off, if I can jump in real quick, Nate, and then I'll let you ask a question. But I love this image of the balcony and kind of being over a conversation and thinking about what's happening. What are some questions that as people may try that kind of a strategy? I mean, I think that's really helpful cross-culturally, but I think any pastor and any time they're sitting down with someone across the table from them, any leader, we're sitting down with someone across the table from us, we should be thinking about those things. And I think it probably fits into those 4 categories you mentioned, but I wondered if there are specific questions you ask about, what emotions am I feeling right now as I'm in this setting? What emotions are they feeling? What kind of questions go on in your mind as you engage in a conversation? Not so that you're not present with the person, but so that you can be aware of what's happening. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And actually you're going to be more fully present as you answer those questions. I mean, you're right. It's not like you're checking out, but you are in a moment so that and the brain works so fast. I hope they don't know you're doing it, but anyways. And for me, you asked a couple of those, but beyond the questions you've asked, it's like, for me, I always ask myself, where's my gut? Am I twisted? Am I nervous? Am I trying to impress? Do I feel intimidated? I always start with me first before I try to understand them.
Yeah.
So, and you know, in any conversation, like even here, I mean, you know, I stuttered and stammered a moment ago. I'm thinking, oh man, what did they think of that? I mean, I literally caught myself thinking that. Well, again, that can lead to feelings inferiority and all kinds of other things. Yeah, and the wheel that is showing is one of the wheels that we use, and those inside wheels, like anger. Look at the red one, anger. I mean, you know, we often will experience anger, but we have no clue that what's the cause of that anger. Are we being let down, humiliated? Are we betrayed? And so the goal is to work toward the outside of that circle. Nate, you want to talk more about that?
Yeah. Something that I did early on when going through assessments and knowing, just for me, in increasing my EQ by identifying my emotions and then being able to state why. I had a different chart. Greg sent me this chart, but I simply just printed out a few of these and hung them up around our house. And periodically, as we were gathered in the kitchen or in the dining room, I'd just stop and we'd have a conversation as a family and just say, hey, everybody just stop and identify, what are you feeling right now and why? And it was great, a great conversation starter with the family. But number two, again, kind of fostering that culture of in family of origin and that sort of thing, to be able to identify your own emotions as well as be able to state why, and then to manage other emotions. So I think for me, having a visual like this is helpful and kind of help to chart conversations maybe that you're having with a coworker, a boss, an employee, a missionary. Maybe we're having to have some difficult conversations or good conversations. I think something like this can kind of help us into to identify and kind of shape what we're feeling and why, and then where do we go from there.
Yeah, and I would suggest that it's interesting, you know, Andrew, in light of your question too. You know, not only am I asking myself what in my gut, what am I experiencing, good, bad, and different kind of thing, but I'm also asking that about the other person, and that's simply teaching myself to read their body language, their tone, their eyes. I mean, their eyes are such a gateway to emotions. Are their eyes fixed on you? Or are they guarding what they won't look at you? I mean, you know, that tells you all kinds of stuff about their emotions. So that's part of the skill sets of learning. And, but it is, you first got to, from my observation, both with me and with others, you first have to identify it and label it before you can actually understand it. Yeah. So,
yeah. Just from a practicality standpoint, I liked, you know, kind of a case study or just a follow-up question to some of the stories you shared. And I'm thinking through a missions pastor's hat or lens. When you recognize that there were missionaries or missionary leaders on the field that had a low EQ, what was it? I mean, just from a very basic, you know, practical perspective, what was it that stood out to you, that communicated to you that, you know what, hey, there may be some low EQ here? And then how, as a missions pastor or a pastor or somebody who's part of the missions committee, as we're becoming kind of aware of this, and maybe those of us on the call, we've learned, we've gone through, we know about wiring and calling and what all that entails, but how do we have those conversations with others in terms of informing and helping them to increase their EQ when they may not know anything?
You really want me to answer both those questions in 7 minutes?
Yep.
And I have another question, so you better have to do it quicker than that.
Well, I'll do the first one. The first one's really easy. How did I assess those missionaries on the spot who were not? Well, first of all, when I was asking deep probing questions, they kept it. They were responding with humor, sarcasm. They couldn't give me emotionally deep answers. They couldn't give me appropriate answers. And as I watched them interact with each other, when there were great opportunities for them to empathize with another person, they would shut down. You could see them shut down their own emotions, or watch them, even as a husband and wife, deal with some issues. There was no empathy at all. So no one sharing it. And for me, one of the real flags is sarcasm, by the way. Sarcasm is usually a sign that one is uncomfortable with emotions. And so we resort to as it's called, the lowest form of humor, usually at the other's expense, to avoid that. Then the other question was, how do I
how do you approach, I mean, so in that context, how would you talk to them about what you're seeing and what you're experiencing, some of the having low EQ?
And so for me, it's like, and I do this all the time, who taught you how to, and say in a positive sense, where did you learn to deal with emotions? Where did you learn to deal with conflict? Where did you learn to read other people? And they'll say, well, no one ever did. And I'm thinking in my head, well, that's obvious. But, I'll say, well, have you ever thought about, trying to develop that skill set and how that might impact you as a leader or you as influencing other people? So it's always good with questions. You never tell people, you always ask questions. But for me, it always starts with, where did you learn how to deal with conflict? Good, bad, or indifferent. I'm really curious. And I share my story. And I grew up in a house that we didn't learn it. And it wasn't until someone loved me enough in my life to say, hey, you might want to start doing these things. So
I think that points to kind of this question that we had from somebody in attendance. They said, beyond teaching others to identify their emotions, what are some things that we can do to manage others' emotions? So talking about managing other people's emotions, what can we do in order to manage others' emotions?
Well, one of the things, and it is a follow-up to that example, is that as you begin to read other people, you can ask them questions like, what's a high low, what's a high today, what's a low today. And if you don't hear any kind of emotional kind of attachment to that, or if it's just events and kind of stuff, then you got a lot more difficult work. If they'll say, well, lows, I really got discouraged when something happened. Well, then that's a great opportunity to begin to go in there. Well, how do you handle discouragement? When you get discouraged, how do you know you're discouraged? What are the signs that you see you're discouraged? And how do you see that in other people? And how do you help other people wrestle through those things? And, the answer to most of those questions is, I don't know. And so that just says, I didn't either, but someone helped me. And so, could I help you? I mean, would you be willing to go walk through that if you want? And I usually advocate, by the way, 1 Timothy 3:10 says, if someone wants to be a leader, specifically a deacon in that context, if someone wants to be a leader, let them first be tested, and only after they've shown themselves approved, you then use them as leader. So in that spirit, I'll ask them to read a book first. And after they've read the book, then come talk to me, or we'll have a conversation. And you'll tell if they're really motivated, they'll read the book. If they're not motivated, if they never read the book, then don't waste your time. I'm sorry, but I got too much stuff to do than just hang around people who don't want to change.
That's great.
Yeah. Andrew, any other questions or anything?
Yeah, I don't have any other questions. We did a quick poll, and of the 13 people in attendance, 6 said that they responded to our poll. 4 have done EQ assessments and 2 haven't. So it looks like there's a good number of people who have heard about EQ and are working to try to figure that out, which I think is really good.
Well, if you go to truewiring.com, it's right now we've got gifts, spiritual gifts, and conflict profile. EQ will be up in probably 3 to 4 weeks. We're really close to getting the EQ up. And then motivators will be last. But yeah, they'll be going up here pretty shortly. And we're actually developing 360s on each of those as well. So, but yeah, I mean, just if someone wants to take just a free, free and easy one, that's not a bad one to take. So
yes, that's True Wiring. I can put it in the chat. TRUE wiring.com. Oh, yeah. You're so good. Okay, awesome.
Yep. Yeah.
Great.
Well, hey, Greg, thank you so much for jumping on here. And I know so much of EQ is below the surface. You kind of scratched the surface of EQ and have given us kind of a brief picture of EQ at a very high level, and given us a lot of opportunities and directions to, for us to be able to dig down deeper as we need to, whether it's, I haven't done the journaling to the extent that you have. That's something that's on my list of things to do for this year and habits to start for this year. So I thank you for that challenge and hearing that. But again, thank you so much for being here. Appreciate your work and your time in joining us.
And they want that. Do you want me to send a copy? You've got a copy of that you can send, because they want that, the leadership or the emotions wheel. Do you want me to send that, or do you already have that? Obviously you showed it.
If you could send that to me, I don't think I have it like in a PDF or JPEG format.
I've got it in a PDF. I'll send it to you, and you can send it out to everybody.
Perfect.
And then we have emails for everyone that registered, so we can send it out to everyone that's registered, and they can get a copy of it.
I'll do that. Okay.
Awesome.
Well, for those of you that joined us today, thank you so much for watching our very first episode or webinar of Church Goes Global. We hope this was helpful for you and your church and your ministry as well.
And hopefully start a conversation that can continue on. Join us on March 6th for a continuing conversation looking at now from EQ now to CQ and how that connects to our theology and life with our special guest, Esther Jadhav. Again, you can register for that on the link, or we'll be putting it on our Facebook page. Make sure you look back if you want to rewatch any of this, or if you missed something, this should be posted very shortly. So thanks so much for joining us. We appreciate having you. And thank you, Greg, for your time today.
My privilege. Thank you.